Excellent. Mark, congratulations on being the winner of the British Society of Criminology Hate Crime Network, Sophie and Sylvia Lancaster Book Prize 2023. What inspired you to write this book?
Hi, Irene. First of all, I'm absolutely delighted and honoured to have received the prize. The book really is the culmination, really, of about 10 to 15 years of both my theoretical work and all of the empirical research that I've been doing on the causes and consequences of hate crime. And so the premise of the book really is that over the last 30, maybe even 40 years now, hate crime has been conceptualized and defined both in policy and through legal scholarship in a way which I feel is too narrow. It's been conceptualized within a traditional liberal framework of criminal law, where the hate element of a hate crime has been seen as something that's added on to offences that already exist. Yeah, so we have the criminal offence of assault, and it becomes a hate crime if it's aggravated, it's made a bit worse by someone's motivation. You know, that motivation might be hatred, but it might be prejudice or bias or contempt or hostility or whatever it may be. And on the other side, my other work in criminology and victimology, the way in which hate crime has been theorized there sometimes can be quite nebulous. And when you try and operationalize those sort of theoretical explications of hate crime, it can become over-inclusive, or they don't adequately consider theories of criminal law and criminalization. So what I'm trying to do in this book is to bring those two disciplines together and to synthesize our understandings of why we criminalize conduct and how we criminalize conduct with our understandings about what are the causes and consequences of hate crime, what's our knowledge base that's been developed over the years in criminology and victimology, so that we can try and create a framework where we have a better, clearer, more coherent understanding of what is hate crime and how can we prevent it, both through policy, practice and law.
Excellent, thank you. So on that note, the book sets out a new theoretical framework for the criminalization of hate, referred to as law and social justice liberalism. Can you tell us a bit more about this new theory?
So, in a way, it's not a new theory. It's kind of building on theories of justice and social justice. Okay, so the theory asserts at its core that the law has a key role in advancing social justice, and that's nothing new, that's nothing groundbreaking. Okay, so there's lots of work by various different scholars around the law and its role in promoting equality, justice and social justice, and in particular that those individuals who've worked in that area focus on things like human rights, equality legislation, even like taxation law, for example, redistribution of wealth and so on and so forth. Perhaps what I'm doing more innovatively is arguing that the criminal law ought to have a role within the field of social justice and advancing social justice. And the way in which it may have a role is by expanding the scope of how we understand harm within society and within liberal frameworks of criminal law. And so I draw on a number of different political philosophers, and in the main, John Rawls, looking at his difference principle, which asserts that economic and social inequality can only be justified if they are to the greatest benefit of the least advanced members of society. And so I use that theoretical work to argue that the criminal law actually may have a role in advancing members of society who are disadvantaged. And traditionally speaking, the criminal law really only deals with harms of a sort of primary nature. So if a particular act or conduct causes harm to an individual, such as, you might be punched in the face, or someone might steal your property, so on and so forth. Those are sort of harms which apply to an individual, and that's seen as an infringement on their personal autonomy, yeah, or it's a setback of their personal interests, as Feinberg defined it. What I'm saying is that within criminal law, hate crime law may play a really important role in unearthing harms that go beyond these individual infringements of personal autonomy or the setting back of an individual interest, to say that the criminal law should expand its lens to look at harm in a way which encompasses social injustices. So what is social injustice? Conventionally, it's been understood as the problem of inequality in terms of economics, yeah, distribution or redistribution of wealth, so that people are more equal. What I argue in the book is that actually there are a number of social injustices that are caused by crimes like hate crime, which can result in entire groups of people experiencing oppression. And those individuals might be affected by particular types of crime in ways in which other people in society are not impacted. And so here I argue in the book that if we understand hate crime as a form of oppression, we can better respond to it through the law and through criminal justice measures. And so I use the work here of Iris Young and her Faces of Oppression, okay, to say that, look, hate crime, it's not just an individual act, a basic crime, which is made a bit worse by a bad motivation, but actually it is a social process which is causal to social injustice through 4 faces of oppression. So through violence, people feel oppressed through violence. If they are attacked because of their identity, they're more likely to experience heightened levels of, emotional harm. They're more likely to experience physical injury, and that ripples out to entire groups of people who might also fear that they will be targeted because of their identity. So group identity is key to understanding hate crime because it's key to understanding its unique and distinct harms. But beyond those individual acts of violence, hate crime can also cause marginalization. Yeah, it may restrict people's access to resources and to building capacities within society, which enables them to be free to participate equally in society. Hate crimes can also result in feelings of powerlessness. Powerlessness is your ability to change your situation in society, to make a better life for you. Yeah. It can also have a toxifying effect on culture. Yeah. What Iris Young refers to as cultural imperialism, or what I refer to as cultural harm, or others refer to as cultural harm. And these harms are multiplying and intersecting. Yeah. So hate crime isn't just an act of violence against an individual, it can affect entire groups of people, resulting in marginalization, feelings of powerlessness, and it can pollute entire environments which create hostile environments towards those individuals. And collectively, those harms are a form of group-based oppression. And the criminal law, I assert, within a framework of social justice liberalism, should consider those harms when it constructs laws, when it constructs the tests and models that are used within those laws, and when it considers appropriate justice sanctions to respond to the harms that are caused by those types of crime.
Thank you, Mark. You also highlighted the distinct harms of hate crime based criminal conduct. The book sets out a comprehensive analysis of the harms of hate crime as a form of group-based oppression, as you said, and uses this to set out specific criteria for the inclusion of protected characteristics under legislation. Can you tell us a bit more about what these criteria involve?
Yeah, so if we understand hate crime as a form of group oppression, we need to unearth group oppression in society and use different laws and different policies to address that or to prevent it, yeah, to lift those groups up and to ensure that they are not experiencing marginalization, powerlessness, where they're not operating within cultures that are hostile towards them. Yeah. So for me, key to understanding who do we identify and protect within a liberal social justice framework of law involves balancing liberalism, yeah, which is freedom, autonomy, individual responsibility, limiting the law so that it doesn't encroach upon those important principles, while at the same time balancing the need for the state to protect individuals from targeted abuse, which is causal to social injustice. Yeah. So you have to balance those two things. So it has to be limited. There has to be boundaries. Otherwise, the criminal law overextends itself. And so what I say is that group identity is key to understanding hate crime, because it's group identity which is linked to the heightened harms of hate crime. Yeah. The reason that individuals are more likely to experience psychological harm, the reason that entire groups of people experience those harms vicariously, and we've shown that through multiple studies in the Sussex Hate Crime Project that I utilize a lot throughout the book, that shows that if one individual is attacked, other individuals are likely to experience heightened perceptions of threat. Yeah. And that we know that those heightened perceptions of threat result in certain emotions such as anger, anxiety, vulnerability, and even feelings of shame, which is quite unique to hate crime. And that those emotions are then linked to certain behaviors such as avoiding going out, changing your appearance, avoiding certain locations, avoiding certain people. Those are social harms which prevent people from fully participating in society. Yeah, it oppresses them. So in identifying the groups that ought to be protected, we need to first of all identify whether a particular group of people are experiencing disproportionate levels of violence or abuse, yeah, or particular types of crime because of their identity. And on top of that, does that particular type of crime, which is targeted against a particular group, result in these enhanced or distinct harms? Yep. Violence, marginalization, powerlessness, and cultural imperialism or cultural harm. Yeah. So what groups are being targeted? Do they experience those forms of violence or criminality in a way which results in group oppression? And then finally, is it necessary for the criminal law to create specific hate crime offences to prevent that, to protect those groups against that particular form of victimisation? And that final criteria, necessity, involves a balancing act between competing human rights. So it might be that there's freedom of expression rights that we need to consider, yeah? It might be that there are practical reasons that we don't want to criminalise certain types of prejudice-based conduct because the law already has considered those, and adding a further layer on top of that, proving hate, for example, prejudice within an offence, might overcomplicate the system. And we've seen that recently with the Law Commission's analysis of whether, sexual violence or domestic violence should be classified as misogyny-based hate crime, yeah? And their argument was that, well, if you do that, it's so difficult anyway to prove sexual violence because of issues around consent and, complexities around that, that if you add the additional layer of hate, that might mean that there's even fewer prosecutions, even fewer convictions, right? So there are practical issues that you need to consider. But the two main criteria are, is it prevalent? Is it based on group identity? And does that result in group oppression based on those four faces of oppression that I articulate in the book?
Excellent. So against these criteria, you also provide recommendations on how legislators should construct hate crime laws. Can you please share with us these recommendations?
As you've asked so nicely, I can. Yeah, so, this is the key, right? So you have a theoretical framework as to why should we criminalize hate? And that's really important, yeah? If we don't really understand why we should do something, then creating the how we do it, the framework, can become disjointed, or it can become, fragmented, and different places do it in different ways and different jurisdictions do it in different ways. And then that creates confusion around, what is it that we're trying to do or achieve, nationally, internationally, or even globally. So in the book, I have collated as many hate crime laws as I could find globally, and I was able to identify over 190 jurisdictions that have some form of hate crime legislation, and I codify those and look at the different types and how are they working, how are they operating, what are the practical implications, what are the conceptual complexities of implementing hate crime in different jurisdictions. The first thing, based on the book, is that if you're going to criminalize hate and take it seriously, you need to do it in a way which recognizes its unique and distinct harms. Now, currently, the UK and most other countries around the world have defined hate crime in law by saying, look, you need to have a basic offence that's already criminalised, yeah? And then once you've got that, we will consider the hate element, but we'll do that at the end of the process, or we'll do it in a way which just says this basic offence, say assault, is just made a little bit worse by this bad motivation. What I argue in the book is that needs to be flipped. Yeah, the hate has to be at the forefront, because it's the hate, it's the prejudice which creates the distinct harms. Those harms, yeah, ripple effects, marginalization, feelings of powerlessness, cultural imperialism, those harms are greater than someone having a bruised arm, yeah, or someone's mobile phone has been stolen. At the moment, the criminal law says the stealing of the mobile phone or the bruised arm, that's the public wrong, that's the harm, it's just made a bit worse by the hate. And I say, no, look, if we're to take hate crime seriously, you have to codify it in a way that says this is a hate crime, yeah? It might be that you say it's called bias crime or prejudice motivated crime or hostility based crime, but it has to be labelled, and we talk about fair labelling in criminal law theory, it has to be labelled in a way that reflects its distinct and unique harm. So criminal law should reflect that. There should be specific offences that say this is a hate crime. you are being prosecuted with a hate crime or a bias crime or prejudice crime, however you want to label it, but that the prejudice part is forefronted in that. Yeah. If you don't do that, you're always saying that the hate bit is secondary. But also, if you don't do that, if you require an underlying basic offence, which a lot of the international organisations working in this area define hate crime as, then what about other conducts and activities or states of affair that are expressions of hatred, which are causing harm in society? They can never be labelled hate crime, can they? Because there's no basic offence for them if it hasn't already been prescribed. Yeah, so there might be lots of different things that we would consider worthy of criminalisation that can't be under the current framework, the way in which it's defined. Yeah, so we need laws, substantive laws that say this is a hate crime. Yeah. Then you have to think about, well, once you've got those laws, say prejudice-based assault, whatever you want to call it, how do you then operationalize that in a way which means that you are able to prosecute effectively, convict, label it, and then sentence it properly? And so I'm not going to go into detail because it gets really, really technical, but there are lots of different models and legal tests that are used. And I advocate in the book two models, really. One is called the demonstration test model, which is part of the animus model, where if someone commits a crime and during that crime they demonstrate or express hostility or prejudice, then that should be prosecuted as a hate crime. And not all countries do that. England and Wales have a framework where a crime can be prosecuted as an aggravated offence where there is a demonstration of hostility. Most other countries use a motivation of hostility. That's part of the mens rea element of criminal law rather than the actus reus element. So I say, look, if there's an expression of hostility during the commission of an offence, that should be sufficient for there to be a hate crime because of the impact it has. Yeah, it doesn't matter whether you're motivated by hatred. If you're expressing it and you do that intentionally, purposefully, then you are causing violence towards that group. You are causing marginalization. You are causing powerlessness, and you are promoting toxic environments which are hostile towards those groups. The other model that I advocate is what's called the by reason model, the group selection model, right? So if someone is selected by reason of their identity, yeah, and we've already said in law, look, that group is worthy of protection based on the fact that they are disproportionately targeted, that these are the harms that occur when they are targeted, that model should also be used. And in particular, that can be really useful for certain types of hate crime where there isn't always these vocal expressions of hostility, and disability hate crime is a key example here. If someone's selected because they're disabled, more often than not, that's happening because of someone's contempt for their disability, yeah, or that they see them as weak or incapable or worthless or just less worthy of our social respect. Just because they're not really hateful towards disabled people, the fact that they are biased against disabled people and they're selecting them at least partly because of their disability, that should be prosecuted as a hate crime. And in England and Wales, those crimes often aren't prosecuted as hate crimes, or if they are, they're very rarely convicted as hate crimes. Yeah, because they're seen as, oh no, that's about vulnerability, that's just about their weakness and their perceptions that that person was vulnerable, not that they're showing them contempt or that they're being prejudiced towards them. So I think those models reflect the framework that I'm advocating, the social justice liberal framework that says, look, we need to unearth crimes and groups who are being targeted by certain types of crime, which is causal to their group oppression. And if that's linked to bias, prejudice, contempt, hostility, or hatred, then those should be codified and prosecuted as hate crimes.
This is really changing how we construct hate crime in laws, right? In terms of restorative justice, can this play a role, and what role in terms of advancing social justice?
Yes, so I mean, I talk about this at the start of the book, and then I come back to it at the very end. So if you don't get to the end of the book, you might be like, well, hang on a minute, how can you be advocating this social justice liberal framework when hate crime laws are all about punishing people more and putting more people in prison? And we know that, you know, enhanced punishments don't deter offenders. You know, you're going to put people in prison where there's really toxic environments of masculinity and homophobia and racism and Islamophobia. You know, you're just going to make things worse. How is that going to create a fairer society? And so what I argue in the book is, look, we have been focused so firmly within this discipline on liberal constructions of criminal law and criminal justice, which says, look, if you criminalize something, that means that you have to punish someone. Yeah, that means if you want to make that a more serious offense, that means there's more punishment. Yeah, retribution theory, punitivism. When I say, what I argue is that we can change the lens not only through how we understand harm, but how we can respond to criminality as well. So if you label something as a crime and say that this is a serious crime, that doesn't mean that you have to create enhanced levels of punishment. What you could do, and what others of course have advocated for decades now, is to offer a restorative framework of justice. So you still have criminal laws that say this is a public wrong, this is a serious criminal offence, but your response to that might be a restorative response. And I suppose I would label myself as a maximalist in terms of restorative justice. That is to have a system of justice where the aim is to restore harm. And you could do that through restorative justice meetings like conferencing, but you might also have a system where you use reparation orders, where you have community service, which is focused on, you know, making amends, you know, working to improve things. That system is at the forefront of our criminal justice system, yeah, so that we have as a first port of call a restorative solution. How can that harm be repaired, whether it be through dialogue, community work, even through rehabilitation programs, working around empathy and so on and so forth. So at the start you have a restorative response, but underneath that you will maintain a system of penalties and punishment, because we know that restorative justice can be really beneficial. Yeah, it can work really well in restoring relationships, in repairing harms at the micro level between individuals, but also at the community level, and even at the macro level when states are the ones who have harmed communities. But if that doesn't work, you know, if someone says, I'm not willing to participate, I'm not willing to take accountability, yeah, I'm not willing to listen to that person, then there has to be a fallback that says, well, there is a system of penalties that must kick in, yeah, and that those must be proportionate to the seriousness of the harm. So it's kind of an underlying threat of punishment, really, but that we want to start with a system that says, look, we need to get to the root causes of this issue. That can be done through dialogue, which focuses on harm, how harm is repaired. And it's not just about, of course, that individual taking responsibility for all of the structural issues in society. You've committed a hate crime and you now need to take responsibility for, you know, the marginalization of that entire group. It's not saying that, it's saying that you have some responsibility and you need to understand how your actions have fed in to the structural issues that occur in society, and that restorative justice can use other community members who come in to that system, other state agents who come into what's kind of referred to as a multi-agency approach to restorative justice, to say, look, how can we collectively repair these harms, make sure they don't happen again? And I've seen restorative justice work where the police have themselves been the harmers, yeah, where they have been racist towards someone in their response to a complaint of racism. And a multi-agency approach within restorative justice can hold the perpetrator, the accused, the offender to account, but also those institutions who have caused secondary harm say, look, you have a responsibility to protect these individuals from hate crime, not to make it worse. These are your policies on this, and you need to adhere to them. And within that framework where you have multiple actors, you can hold different institutions to account for their own policies, as well as holding the offender to account as well. It's not an easy task, but it is one that can be done and is, I think, an improvement on the current system that we have, which perpetuates harm very often for the most marginalized groups in society.
Absolutely agree. And we know it works. The evidence is there, and your work is very much based on evidence. What further research have you undertaken or you think should be done to address this issue further?
Are you saying that my 15 years of empirical work is just not enough, Irene, and that I need to do more? Can I not take just a short break before I undertake? Okay, yeah, being serious. There's so much more work that needs to be done. That's what motivates me. That's what gets me out of bed every morning. There's still so much knowledge to be gained and so much learning to be had. I'm particularly interested at the moment in the exponential rise of anti-trans hatred, the causes of that. I think there's a greater focus needs to be put now on politics and political rhetoric and different social movements. And how they are resulting in an increase of hate crime. And I think we have seen over the last 5 years an actual increase in hate crime. Having observed the data, the victimization data, the police data, everything else over the last 20 years, I think we've seen a decrease in hate crime over that period. Not a sufficient one. There's still so much of it, and we've got no time to rest. But from the sort of 2000s and mid 1990s, 2000 onwards, there was a decrease in most types of violent crime, and especially hate crime. But over the last 5 years, the research suggests that that's now increasing, and for some groups like the trans community, that's increasing exponentially. So there needs to be research into why that's happening, how it's happening, and what can be done. And my concern is that the law is being undermined. And I'm a big advocate of the expressive function of law. And I think that hate crime legislation has played a really important role in challenging hate in society. I think the current government has created a political narrative and produced policies which specifically undermine the expressive function of the law. And we see now that there is, as a result, an increase in hate crime. So some more research around how that's happening, why it's happening, as well as more research around whether restorative justice is an effective response to hate crime. And we're seeing more and more police services and more institutions internationally use it for hate crime. There's a growing interest. So I think my book in 2014 remains like the only sort of medium-sized study on restorative justice. So someone else, come on, do a big study on it, and we need some more research on that too.
Absolutely. As a final point, and related to the current anti-trans climate, whether it's in politics, media, and so forth, in light of the sentencing in the case of Brianna Ghey on Friday, the 2nd of February 2024, can you share with us your thoughts on the case, including the police ruling out transphobia initially, media and politicians dead-naming Brianna, and also the CPS and judge recognizing the aggravating factor in the case?
I mean, this is reflective of cultural imperialism, isn't it? One of the faces of oppression that Irish Young set out, and which I build on in my book. Institutional prejudice and institutional transphobia is problematic. Yeah, there's always the sort of search for an excuse that something isn't prejudice, and only when you've got the evidence, firmly in your face, can you say, oh, okay, maybe it was, you know, there's always this kind of denial of prejudice, this resistance to it being a part of a serious crime like this. And, you know, despite all of those WhatsApp messages and all of the evidence that, you know, that they're maintaining that transphobia wasn't at least part of the reasons why Brianna was targeted, is incredibly unfortunate. And I do think it reflects the institutional transphobia that exists within our police forces. So firstly, you know, it was really important that Justice Yip in that case clearly and publicly stated that transphobia played a role in her murder. And even though it was just one cause, you know, amongst probably several, it's important to show that hate crimes aren't just crimes that are fully and solely motivated by hatred, but they are crimes where there is some form of expression of prejudice towards an individual. And often hate crimes have multiple causal mechanisms. Yeah, it's very rare that someone just goes out through pure hatred and targets someone. Of course, that happens. But hate crimes are expressions of prejudice through forms of criminality, and this was a clear example of that. So it's really important that that was expressed by the judge. I think it's unfortunate that you cannot prosecute someone for a transphobic hate crime. It's always something for transphobic hate crime in particular, same for sexual orientation and disability, where you are sentenced and that it's mentioned at sentence as an aggravating factor. Here, it will affect the tariff, but it's not something that you can add to the charge sheet. You know, someone isn't charged and prosecuted with a transphobic hate crime. It's just something that's mentioned at the end in sentencing. So I think it's important it was, because that expressive function of the law, as I was talking about earlier, is really important to say that this was a hate crime and it should be labelled as such. And yeah, and of course that directly refutes what the police were saying. The judge has, you know, reviewed all of the evidence, seen all the evidence, and made that determination, and it's really important that she did.
That's excellent. Is there anything that I haven't asked you and you would like to add before we close the podcast?
Not really. Well, the book and the thesis that it puts forward is a normative theory. Yeah, it's about how things could be, and how things might be in the future. It's not how it is at the moment, and you know, the way in which the law operates in this country is one where reform can be very slow, and reformists within the establishment are particularly cautious. We do need to have a system where all of the protected characteristics are included in the criminal law, and that's not the case at the moment. We still have this fragmented system where some of the characteristics can be used at sentencing, some can be used, race and religion, as part of the actual charge for specific types of offences. So that there needs to be reform there, and the government needs to be open to identifying other groups who experience group-based oppression, and misogyny being one of them. And I know that's an area that you work in particular, and that we have had discussions about before, and we've written a blog article, haven't we, together on that. So yeah, there are other forms of oppression that need to be unearthed, and there are reforms that need to be put in place for the law to operate more effectively. And until that happens, I don't believe that the law can be as impactful as it could be in terms of preventing and challenging hate crime.
Completely agree. I want to say thank you so much for your time and insight, and also all the amazing work that you do in the field of hate studies. Thank you so much.
That's very kind. Thank you. And thank you to you too, Irene. You're doing amazing trailblazing work yourself.
Thank you.